Good morning. This is Carrol Henderson. I'm going to be sharing with you some information today about how trumpeter swans have returned to Minnesota over the last 40 years or so. Trumpeters were originally found through much of north central United States, western Canada, and into southern Alaska. And they existed in Minnesota for many thousands of years.
Yeah, Carrol, can I interrupt for just a minute? I'm sorry, guys. This is Margaret Smith from the Trumpeter Swan Society, and on the right-hand side, you may see our education committee. We'll get back to them really at the end of the webinar. So for the panelists here, if you want to just turn off your video and mute yourself, that's fine. Carrol, you can just stay on, and if you ever want to get rid of your picture, that's fine too, or just keep it on. So, all right. Thanks so much. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Carrol.
Okay. Trumpeter swans disappeared in the pioneer era because they were used for food, and the pelts or skins were actually sold for feathers to Europe to use in making ladies' powder puffs. The last record of trumpeter swans in Minnesota were from 1884 to 1885. They were extirpated at that point, meaning they were totally gone from the state. Trumpeters were killed for their meat, their down, and the wing feathers were even used for writing quills. John James Audubon used trumpeter quills for drawing the fine detail in bird feet in his many, many hundreds of drawings. The trumpeters existed finally by 1935 at 69 swans that remained in the West. Elsewhere, they were only reminders with books like The Trumpeter Swan, The Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White, and place names. This is the typical swimming profile of a trumpeter swan, with the head straight up, the tertials, the wing feathers lying along the back, and they have a little red margin on the edge of the bill and black skin leading to the eye. And they have a sloping forehead, much like the sloping forehead of a canvasback duck. This is a trumpeter cygnet in its first winter. It's just starting to get the black coloration on the skin leading to the eye. In contrast, the mute swan is a bird from England, showing its posture with the raised wing feathers, the tertials, the bright orange bill, and the knob above the bill. This is not a native species for the United States. In Minnesota, they are considered an unprotected, undesirable, exotic species, not being allowed to establish breeding areas. The trumpet of the swan is quite a fascinating structure. Their windpipe extends back into the sternum, up, and does a loop. And so when the bird is flying, they can be heard up to several miles away because their trumpet is almost 3 feet long. Another swan that we have passing through Minnesota is the tundra swan. They come through in late November and again in the spring to areas up in Alaska, Northwest Territories, and then they winter on the East Coast offshore from Maryland and Virginia. About 80% of tundra swans have that yellow teardrop marking in front of their eyes and a more rounded, like a Charlie Brown top of their head, rather than the sloping forehead of a trumpeter swan. Here's a comparison of the markings that are very definitive to tell the difference between a trumpeter swan and a tundra swan. The trumpeter's feathering on top of the bill comes down to a point, whereas on a tundra swan, the feathering is rounded across the front and the bill is obviously shorter. Here's a trumpeter flight profile showing the exceptionally long neck, and it's almost 5 feet long in flight. I used to be a taxidermist, so I could make these birds do whatever I wanted them to. I compared these trumpeter swan, a tundra swan, and a snow goose for size comparison. The snow goose is a legal game bird during waterfowl season. They have black wingtips, and the trumpeter is protected. And you can see there's quite a significant difference between the profile and markings of a snow goose and trumpeter swan that obviously should provide little problem for hunters in distinguishing the difference. And we actually have very few problems with people shooting trumpeter swans illegally anymore because this has been well publicized during annual waterfowl seasons. Here's a comparison of a dead swan, in this case, a tundra swan and a snow goose. Trumpeters mate for life and begin nesting at the age of 4 years. Now, if they lose a mate, they will remate again and may have several mates during the course of their long life. The first year for a trumpeter swan is spent with the parents, learning food preferences, migratory routes, and a wintering destination. They migrate south together, they migrate back north together. And in the second year, after being driven from their nesting territory where they hatched a year previously, they're driven by the parents out into the open world where they have to fend for themselves. Here you have some, what you might call the teenager 2-year-old swans out in a grain field, exploring the surrounding region and finding a potential mate for the future. There were early concerns about trumpeter swans depredating on crops that were misguided because people saw them out in the fields and thought, oh, maybe they're eating the grain that we just planted, but they were not eating the sprouting grain, they were eating waste grain in the fields from the previous year. Year 3, the swans pair off, they find a wetland territory, and in this case, on June 4th, 2008, southeastern Manitoba, I was with Jan and Jean Collins and Glenn Suggett, and this was one of the first pairs of trumpeter swans that they had observed in southeastern Manitoba. That was back in 2008. And now the birds are spreading very nicely into the southern regions of southeastern Manitoba. Year 4, the trumpeters began nesting. They find the territory, usually on a medium to small lake. They're the only birds on the territory that are defending the territories against other trumpeter swans. They will lay normally from 5 to 7 eggs. They hatch after 32 to 37 days of incubation. Here's one of the newly hatched cygnets. The young swan is called a cygnet, and actually the male is called a cob, and the female adult is called a pen, names of English origin. The high protein diet of young cygnets is necessary for quick growth and is comprised primarily of aquatic invertebrates. After leaving the nest, the cygnets are cared for by both parents who guard them closely, and the cygnets are typically bracketed between the adults to protect them from danger. And the adults are quite tenacious and defensive. They've actually been seen driving Alaskan brown bears away from their nesting site. There's an adult trumpeter with one of the young cygnets out feeding us some sedges and wetland plants on the shore of a pond. The diet changes, and the birds later on become an eating machine, changing mainly to aquatic vegetation rather than aquatic invertebrates. At the age of 14 weeks, cygnets consume about 20 pounds of wet vegetation daily. Here's a nice comparison of how rapidly trumpeter swans grow. From the egg up to 10 weeks, they're almost the size of a Canada goose. These are photos that were taken by DNR biologist Steve Kittleson to monitor the growth as he was rearing the young. Cygnets began to fly at the age of 14 to 15 weeks. Meanwhile, the adults have lost their flight feathers, just like Canada geese do, and they are flightless for a couple of weeks in mid to late summer. So the adults will be not seen in flight for several weeks. And at the same time, this is when the cygnets will be gaining flight as well. The trumpeter swans will overwinter in open water areas from Minnesota south, including Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, and Ohio, and occasionally in Kansas and Oklahoma. And this whole migration phenomenon is being monitored under a research study by Dr. David Anderson and faculty at the University of Minnesota in these states with radio telemetry equipment. And that project will be completed next June. About half of the swans stay in Minnesota during the winter, the other half are migrating. As I mentioned earlier, trumpeter swans winter together and return to their nesting marshes and lakes in the spring with the cygnets they raised the previous year. And that's when they drive the young away from the nest. And as we look back on the history of trumpeter swans in Minnesota, Hennepin Parks was the pioneer who really got everything started back in 1966 with Fred King, who was the Trumpeter Swan Society founder in 1968. And they received a couple of swans to get their project started. And then they received 40 subadult swans from the Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge to get their population started. Their first cygnet hatched in 1969. They had some real waterfowl leaders in their membership board: Al Hookbaum, Peter Ward, Dan Cochran, Cliff French, Robley Hunt, a real team of people who knew their waterfowl and knew how to get things done. And then we had some leaders from Three Rivers Parks, Hennepin Parks at the time: Larry Gillette, Dave Weaver, Tim Dyer, Judy Voigt England, Tim Dyer, and Madeline Link. Here are a couple of the first two swans that were received in September of 1966. This is Donna Compton, who worked with Hennepin Parks as one of their swan biologists. And they had 5 goals set up with the Trumpeter Swan Society: restoration and management, swan watch, swan health, education and research, and outreach and advocacy. And these goals considered to the present, continue to the present. The DNR began its own non-game wildlife program in 1977 and began statewide restoration of wildlife species not traditionally hunted or harvested. And then in 1982, we had a miraculous thing happen because Senator Colin Peterson from Detroit Lakes had created a non-game wildlife checkoff on the 1980 legislative session proposals that allowed people to make donations on their tax form for non-game wildlife. And now people are raising, and Lori Nauman is in charge of the promotions at the checkoff at the DNR. It raises over $1 million per year, and that is double matched by revenue from conservation license plate funds. And we also receive donations of people from their legacy funds. When I first started working on a proposal for restoration of trumpeter swans on a statewide basis, I was a statewide program of one person for the non-game program and a statewide budget of $30,000 per year, and half of that was my salary. When the checkoff passed, the first money came in 1981 and became available in 1982. So the timing was perfect to proceed with an aggressive program for swan restoration. And we worked with Jim Cooper and other biologists from the DNR to put this proposal together. And it was very significant at the time that Roger Holmes, who was section chief for the Department of Natural Resources for Wildlife, said that the trumpeter swan was to be reintroduced to restore part of our lost biodiversity, not to restore this as a game species. The use of federal Pittman-Robertson excise tax funds from the federal government or game and fish funds from the DNR for this restoration project was not allowed. The only funds allowed to be spent to restore the swan were the donations from the non-game wildlife checkoff. And this was an important thing to consider for the future because if this was ever proposed to be a game species in Minnesota, it would be considered a breach of faith by the DNR for not living up to its word to restore this as a protected non-game species. Our goal initially was only 30 breeding pairs of swans. I guess we could say we like to under-promise and over-deliver. We had several release areas in Minnesota. The major release area was northwestern Minnesota in the vicinity of the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge. We also released swans at Heron Lake in southwest Minnesota, at Swan Lake near Nicollet, which originally had trumpeter swans nesting in the Pioneer era, and Hibbing at Black Lake. The place that was best considered a donor area for the trumpeter swans was the Minto Flats, west of Fairbanks, Alaska. We proposed picking 50 trumpeter swan eggs per year in 1986, 87, and 88 in the Minto Flats. This is an area that supports a healthy population of about 1,000 trumpeter swans and very diverse, incredible wetland, amazing wildlife, great fishing. And we had a very special team. We had Rod King, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot who had scouted the area and figured out where all the trumpeter swans were nesting and which ones would be at the right point of incubation. And also DNR volunteer Dave Algren, who was a pilot for Northwest Airlines. Turns out he was also a good friend of Vice President Bill Wren from Northwest Airlines. Well, this is the plane that we used, the float plane we used to provide access to the trumpeter swan nesting area. This was our fisheries cabin for the Alaska Game and Fish Department that we used for our headquarters while we were collecting eggs. And from the air, we found that those trumpeter swans showing up like little pearls on the wetlands on those Minto Flats. And Rod had checked out these lakes to make sure these were lakes where we could access those nests from the plane. This was one of the first pairs that we visited to collect eggs. The pair came off the nest as our plane approached. And then the male stood by the nest as we were approaching. And then I had to get out of the plane onto the bog mat and go slogging towards the nest to get the eggs. But the cob was, I guess, tended to disagree with me. He took off after me. And when you're standing in chest waders, knee deep, you can't exactly jump out of the way. So I just stood my ground and kept shooting pictures as he came towards me. And then at the last second, he dropped into the water and glided past me. Swan's weapon is this little bony knob on the leading edge of its wing at the wrist joint. And that's what they strike their enemies with, the bears or whatever other animals coyotes might try to take their nest. And it's been likened to being hit by a baseball bat. We collected 50 eggs in a long day, leaving 2 live eggs in each nest. Dave and Rod were a great, great team. We measured, labeled the eggs. We candled the eggs to make sure they were viable. We left 2 live eggs in each nest. And we're ready to head out. But we had to keep going back to that fisheries cabin each time we filled up one of the suitcases with the plane. And then Dave worked at the cabin heating water with hot water bottles to warm the eggs while we were out collecting. Here you can see a variety of trumpeter swan eggs. The darker ones are from wetlands that had a higher iron content, and the lighter eggs are from lakes without as much iron. And there's our high-tech system for warming the eggs during our transport from Alaska back to Minnesota. And these are suitcases that were prepared by Steve Kettleson, patterned after the eggs cases that were being used to transport whooping crane eggs by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the time. We had a marathon trip from the time we left Minnesota till the time we got back from our trip. we took just one day to collect the eggs, and then we returned back at midnight and reached the Carlos Avery Wildlife Refuge by 10 o'clock the next morning. And meanwhile, Bill Wren had given us free tickets in the first class section for the swans to fly. So we had some flying eggs there. Dave helped take care of those eggs during the flight back to Minneapolis. We got to get hot water from the coffee maker in the first class section and put in the hot water bottles and keep the eggs warm. So we had to change those every 2 hours. We got back to Carlos Avery. We incubated them in the old pheasant incubators that had been used for years for hatching game farm pheasants. Here are the eggs in the incubators at Carlos Avery in comparison with a chicken egg. Here's Steve Kittleson caring for the eggs. We had to keep the humidity at about 60% for the eggs. And then we weighed the eggs every day because the eggs lose weight steadily as the yolk and the white are converted into a cygnet. Close to hatching, you can hear the cygnets pipping inside the egg. And they hatch after 32, 37 days. We picked the eggs at the point where they only needed about another week of incubation before they hatched. It's quite an exhausting process here for the cygnets. They're treating the essentially what amounts to the umbilical cord for the cygnets after they hatch. Here you can get an idea of how exhausting it is for that little cygnet to hatch. He's getting weighed in. They were weighed daily after that. Now feeling a lot better the next day. And there's one very contented group of cygnets resting after the first week or so. Birds were then transferred to outdoor cages where they were protected above and around from any type of potential predators. They were kept there through the summer, and then at 2 months of age, their wings were clipped so they couldn't fly, because then we were going to put them in outdoor pens. And then we had to use some swan psychology. We divided the swans into two groups because people raising Canada geese had found that if they raised all the geese in one big pen, when they turned them loose, they weren't interested in mating with each other. It was kind of like a brother-sister thing. And so we had to put the swans into two different rearing pens and ponds, and then keep them separated until we were ready to release them. And then the swans were going to be released at 23 months of age. I should mention here that this is a common resting posture for a trumpeter swan. It has one foot raised up into its feathers to keep the foot warmed up. It's not a one-legged swan. Here are the rearing ponds that were constructed out at the Carrol Avery Game Farm. And these are the ponds that were kept open in winter with aerators. And this is what the young of the year swans look like. At the age of 23 months, in May, the swans were rounded up one more time for wing clipping and released in selected marshes of northwest Minnesota. This was always a big adventure. Herding swans, they were reasonably cooperative. And then we clipped the wings because the feathers would grow back in midsummer, so they would be able to fly by fall. Some people wanted to know if the birds were going to fly back to Alaska, but no, they fly from the first place and they will settle in this first area that they fly from. They don't go back to Alaska. They consider Minnesota their home. So they're about 2 years old when we turned them loose. And we found them weighing anywhere from 22 pounds up to 35 pounds for the largest males. This is the largest waterfowl species in the world. Those birds were banded with Fish and Wildlife Service bands. And we had a lot of swans that were donated by the Minnesota Zoo in Apple Valley because they had pairs of swans that raised young every year, but by the next season, they needed to move the swan cygnets somewhere else because there was no habitat for them left at the zoo. There was not enough room. We also used modified cattle ear tags to put in the wings of the swans. We put them in the left wing for females, right wing for males, so we could get their sex at a distance and tell which swans were which. It would not rely on just having to read the leg bands. We kept detailed records for all of the swans that were being released, mainly on the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge and on the White Earth Indian Reservation to the north. And then as we were getting ready for releases, I realized we were going to have, the second year, we were going to have 40 swans to release in northwest Minnesota, but a bumpy truck ride all the way north to Detroit Lakes was going to be potentially endangering the health and the safety of the swans because their legs were more delicate for rugged bouncing like that. And I had been an officer in the Air Force for several years, so I was in the communications maintenance officer with the Air Force and worked with them scheduling and flying with the C-130 airplanes. So I called the local Minnesota Air National Guard office at the Twin Cities and said, do you suppose we might be able to schedule a training flight to fly 40 trumpeter swans up to northwest Minnesota? And they were kind of stunned and silent, but then they said, we'll give you a call back. They called back in a couple of days and they said, that's a great idea. We're with you. We'll do it. So here we are with our Air Force team ready to fly swans to northwest Minnesota. And they were pretty excited about this. So then I called the media offices for NBC, ABC, and CBS in New York City and said, how would you like to cover a story for the largest release of trumpeter swans in the history of the United States? And the first year, ABC News came out, they covered the story. And ABC came the next year. So here we are in our C-130 with all of our swans strapped in. And we were taking them to the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge. And then we got word that Roger Karras was going to come out from ABC News to cover the story and cover it nationally. So then the Air Force had to get permission from the Pentagon to fly our swans up to Detroit Lakes. So that went right through. Apparently, they really liked the idea too. So I don't think we'd ever had to get permission from the Pentagon for a DNR project before. This was Jim's Marsh at Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge, where we were releasing the first swans that first year. And this is a really important project, I think, in the big picture of things, that the swans help provide a really significant interest in wildlife and wetland restoration in Minnesota, because these birds were going back and pioneering and nesting in as many wetlands that people could watch and see and enjoy the hatching and rearing process of the trumpeter swans. Here's our national NBC News crew covering the story in 1987. And here's Roger Karras covering the story in ABC News, 1988. He was with us when we released swans on the White Earth lands and lakes. And he was really quite impressed by the fact that here was a project that was funded by volunteer donations from Minnesota citizens to restore the species. And just an incredible amount of media coverage. This was not without some hazard, though. I ended up being beak to beak with the one swan that was got a little, I guess you could say it got restless as I was holding it, getting ready to release the bird, bit me on the nose. The photographer from one of the TV stations had to pull the bird off my nose before I could release it. And so anyway, the people in the Fargo Forum got quite a chuckle out of that the next day, I'm sure. Here's Steve Kettleson ready to release cygnets, or the swans. And now these are the 2-year-old birds. Peggy Hines was also our expert biologist who had picked out the wetlands for releases. And here's a pair of swans after they were released, stretching their wings. There's Steve helping with the release as well. The release swans began nesting in 1988, and they raised 1 cygnet. 1 was a good start. And then we also had incredible support from birds when they started wintering offshore from the Mississippi River below Monticello. Sheila Lawrence began feeding the birds in 1988 and fed them up until her death in 2011 from cancer. I have a little trilogy of swan stories to share with you here. This is Super Mom number 9. She was hatched one of the first years we had swans in 1989. This was one of a brood of 5 that was survived. She was the only survivor. She showed up at Monticello, and Sheila kept detailed records of every banded swan, and she had a wing tag initially of number 9. She kept coming back every year for 25 years. So now you know how long a swan can live. But not only was she a survivor, she was single-handedly trying to restore the population by herself. This is a picture I took in 2009 when she was 20 years old. This was her 55th cygnet that she hatched and reared in her lifetime. And then when Sheila became sick, the swan production was not recorded for 3 years. Her husband, Jim, was taking care of the feeding of the swans, but he didn't record the details. But she returned again with 2 cygnets in 2013 at the age of 24. So now she was up to 57 cygnets that she raised during her lifetime. And then she came back one last time in 2014 with no young. That was the last time she was seen. So she was a legendary swan, incredibly persistent and a dedicated parent. Now, we did have to deal with some things that were important as swan mortalities here. Illegal shooting, power lines, lead poisoning. And what we have done over the years is to try to promote protection of the swans. The illegal shooting has been really quite insignificant in recent years. There's a lot of good publicity about the swans being protected. And a lot of our hunters are actually quite supportive. And if they see swans fly into a marsh, they yell at other hunters to watch out, don't shoot the swans. They're very protective of the swans as well. And in the early years, we put up signs about don't shoot the swans. And then we had another amazing lesson in swan psychology here. This is DNR Conservation Officer Carrol Henderson holding a swan. And this was the Deerwood rice bed case that he was called to. People saw 2 teenager hunters shoot at a flock of swans, 6 swans flying over a marsh. 2 swans dropped out of the flock. And then he was called, and his partner went out on the marsh in a canoe to find the swans, and they recovered 2 swans. They found an injured one with a broken wing, and they took their canoe up to that swan, and an adult swan, the parent, swam between them and the cygnet to protect the cygnet and keep it from being picked up in the landing net. And finally, they did succeed in getting a hold of the cygnet. And then the other one just sat right by the canoe. So they picked it up and lifted it into the canoe and set it by the cygnet. Well, when they took it to Debbie Escadal at the Garrison Animal Hospital, it was discovered that the cygnet had broken wing and internal injuries. It was quite severely injured. But the adult male was not injured at all. It was simply a very protective male defending its young one. He wasn't going to leave that young one behind. And they decided that the best thing to do in this case was to return the male back out to the Deerwood Marsh, to the rice beds, to rejoin the rest of its family. Unfortunately, the cygnet died a couple of days later. But when you see that kind of incredible parental bond between the swans, you realize how important it is for that whole family to stay together that first year when the parents are providing an example for the young ones of where to go, what to eat, how to live. Power lines can be a problem in areas that are especially near the metropolitan areas and settled areas. A lot of the places where we release swans were fairly free of power lines, so it hasn't been as significant a problem in a lot of our areas of expansion up in northern Minnesota. But it's really unfortunate to find dead ones underneath those power lines. Hennepin Parks has worked with power companies to have flappers put on those wires so that they provide some warning to the swans in flight. Also, trumpeter swans tip downward to feed on aquatic vegetation and pick up grit. They do not dive for food, but they can accidentally eat shotgun pellets on the bottom of marshes while feeding. And this was something that we thought was not going to be a problem anymore. Minnesota banned the use of lead shotgun pellets for waterfowl hunting in 1991. But the lead is still there that was shot decades ago. And in years of low water levels, sometimes the swans can reach the pellets on those marsh bottoms. But it's really important to continue to advocate for use of non-toxic ammunition, because sometimes pheasant hunters will go pheasant hunting in marshy areas adjacent to a wetland, hunting in the cattails and phragmites and shooting at pheasants, supposedly, but the pellets are lead and they're still toxic and they can fall into those marshes. So we're hoping that in the future we can encourage the DNR to require use of non-toxic ammunition on our state wildlife management areas. Here's one of our members of our Trumpeter Swan Society board, Lori Degernes, when she worked at the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota. You can see that when one of these injured swans came in with lead poisoning, they were quite a handful. Unfortunately, if a swan gets lead poisoning, it's possible they can recover, but they will likely never reproduce during their life. These are the contents of a swan gizzard, died in 2003. If you look at the white arrow at the bottom, those are the 3 lead pellets that killed the swan. It doesn't take much. 3 shotgun pellets. And we do have another issue with lead, and every time lead shows up when it's bounded with wildlife, it's a problem. We had a problem several years ago at Vadnais Lake on the north edge of the Twin Cities, where swans were dying from lead poisoning. And Don Tanner is the biologist who has been leading the charge on this. If you look in the upper left there's a very popular fishing area at Vadnais Lake near north of St. Paul at what they call Sucker Channel. And people lose a lot of tackle, sinkers, jigs, whatever, and they're lead. And then the water stays open there in the winter, and swans have been using it heavily. And when they do, they tip down and they're picking up lead fishing tackle, not shot. Now we're looking at fishing tackle. And they lost 16 swans in just 2 years to lead poisoning at Sucker Lake. And this is a really, really unnecessary loss because there is an alternative. We do have non-toxic tackle. Now, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved $1.2 million of Deepwater Horizon remediation funds for Get the Lead Out angler education to go to the Pollution Control Agency, it's to help prevent lead poisoning in loons. But this also benefits swans because if people are using non-toxic fishing tackle, some areas are occupied and nested in by both swans and loons. And twice when I was collecting eggs in Alaska, I found both trumpeter swans and loons nesting within maybe 30 yards of each other. And I think the loons were benefiting by being protected by the very defensive trumpeter swans near them. So we have been urging people to get the lead out of non-toxic fishing sinkers and jigs. And outdoor writers have discovered that tungsten jigs are a wonderful alternative to toxic lead. And if you go to a sporting goods store, you can find many different tungsten alternatives. They're currently more expensive than the lead alternatives, but it's not going to poison our wildlife. Here are the statistics we've ended up with. for trumpeter swans since we began the project in 1987, where we had no breeding pairs. And now you can see the number of pairs has continued to increase, number of cygnets all the way up to 670. And here we have the more recent numbers. In 2001, we had about 1,500 swans, statewide population estimate. We had the number increased to over 6,000 in 2010. And Christine Herwig, with the non-game wildlife program at that time, made an aerial count estimate that came to 17,000 swans. And now our more recent estimates, just 8 years later, have come up with in excess of 50,000 swans, which is totally mind-boggling to me. I never thought we would ever see such an incredible response just within my lifetime. And now we have nest records for trumpeter nesting in 80 of 87 counties in Minnesota. Here's our state breeding bird atlas dot map for nesting swans from 2012. And that was just 3 years later. You can see what's happened. And now I'm sure that dot map would be even more densely spotted. How much is a swan worth? Back in 1990, the egg, $400, yearling, $1,200, a 2-year-old, $2,000, and a 4-year-old breeder would be about $8,000. And then with inflation, you'd have to add about another 35% to those numbers. Swan survival: for every 4 swans released at the age of 2, 1 survived to breed at the age of 4. In contrast, with peregrines that we released, about 1 peregrine out of every 7 or 8 survived to breed. We had many wonderful project partners in this area of restoration, the non-game program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, White Earth Indian Band, Three Rivers Parks, the Trumpeter Swan Society, the Delwood Foundation, and the U.S. Forest Service. And then zoos played a big role in restoration. Minnesota Zoo has provided over 200 swans over the years. Watertown, South Dakota Zoo, Brookfield Zoo, and the Tulsa Zoo all have contributed cygnets and yearlings to the project. One interesting aspect of this is, well, where did those swans go after the release? Chris Sather-Spaeth was a grad student at Bemidji State, 2007 to 2008. And she looked at habitat preferences. 39 of 45 nests were successful. Mean clutch size, 5.8. And they got 197 cygnets from 225 eggs. That's pretty high hatchability. And what did she find? Where did those swans go? The ones that were dispersing north went to lakes that featured bog mats amid spruce and tamarack forest. This helps explain their dispersal to northeast Minnesota, southeast Manitoba, and southwest Ontario. This is the kind of habitat where I collected the eggs from in Alaska. The wetlands that they used were less than 60 acres with cattail edges and 75% or more of forested shoreline. The cattail tubers were a preferred food. And Minnesota is currently fulfilling a very key role right now in trumpeter restoration, because we have, as habitat has been filled in many of these wetlands in Minnesota, the birds are being basically forced to disperse northward into northeastern Ontario and southeastern Manitoba. And we also have a dispersal into the prairie pothole country of North Dakota and South Dakota in the eastern regions of those states. So this has been a very critical role. And of course, there's also dispersal with Wisconsin and Iowa in collaboration as well. How much did our project cost? About $514,000, just over $500,000 over 20 years. And from all those swans that are now out there, we released a total of 372 swans. So that's quite a dramatic response. As I mentioned earlier, wintering destinations: Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, Illinois, Arkansas, Missouri, and about half the birds stay in Minnesota. So they are dispersing, and we will learn more about this when we have those the research completed at the University of Minnesota next year. I have to close with one final story for you. It was January 1997. I had gone to the Jim and Sheila Lawrence home and was sitting on the rocks right by the edge of the Mississippi River, watching the swans. And one of the swans parted from its flock of several dozen swans, and it began swimming towards me. And it got closer and closer. And finally, it got so close, I had to turn my camera sideways so I could get the whole bird in the viewfinder. And then it was standing right in front of me, and I could see the band number. I photographed the band number. And I began talking to the swan in a calm, low voice for several minutes. And then he turned and swam back to the flock. And one time, Dr. Walter Breckenridge from the Bell Museum had told me that when he would visit his wood duck box in the backyard fronting on the Mississippi River every year, he'd go out once a week, he would climb the ladder, and as he would climb the ladder, he would start talking to the wood duck. And he'd get up to the wood duck nest box, he opened the little door on the side of the box, and he could reach in and lift up the duck, count its eggs, set it back down, close the door, and descend the ladder, all the time talking to the duck. And he says, I'm sure that she recognized my voice because wood ducks live a long time. And a predator doesn't talk to its prey before it kills it. So she knew that he didn't have bad intentions. So anyway, she trusted him. And every year he got to lift up the duck, count the eggs, and descend. So I always kind of remembered that. And then I started talking to the swan. We had a nice little discussion over several minutes. And then the swan turned and went back. I went back to the office, checked the number. I discovered that that swan was collected by me as an egg in the Minto Flats of Alaska. And the swan was released on that was in 1988. The swan was released on North Chippewa Lake at the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge in May of 1990. So the swan was 9 years old, and all I can surmise from my experience is that I think he just stopped by to say, hi, Dad, and thanks. Here's my email if anyone's interested, Carrol Henderson at prodigy.net. I worked with the Minnesota DNR from 1974 to 2018. I'm currently writing a book for the University of Minnesota Press about my wildlife conservation career in the DNR, hopefully out sometime by late next year. And this is what I do in my spare time. I've written 13 books, 4 field guides to the wildlife of Costa Rica, 5 books on attracting wildlife for the DNR. And my wife and I lead birdwatching trips internationally each year. We have trips coming up. We're going to be leading a birding trip to Iceland next May and another trip to the rainforests of Brazil next July. So anyway, life is good, and I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to share this information with you. And with that, we can go back to question and answer for the program.
Great. Well, this is Margaret, and Carol, I'm assuming you can hear me. Is that correct? Everybody?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for that. And I want to let everybody know that's attending. We hope you have some questions. And if you would just put them in the Q&A box, and Carol will be happy to answer them. But we also have other people from our education committee for the Trumpeter Swan Society that I kind of like to introduce you to as well. So Marianne Coughlin is there, and she's a global analyst with PwC. Jeff Nelson is our president. Lori Degernes, you saw her photo earlier from the Raptor Center. If you have swan health questions, Lori would be the one to ask about that because she's a emeritus professor of avian medicine. Tiffany Mayo, who is responsible for all the zoo placement and nesting and breeding at zoos, is also available. And Jim Hawkins should be here as well. I don't see his picture, but Jim is also from the Yukon. Oh, there he is. Okay, drinking water. So while you guys are putting in your questions, and I do have some for you, Carol, you had mentioned earlier that there was a recent study about what was it, geese or waterfowl recognizing each other. You want to explain that? I thought that was a pretty interesting little factoid.
Yeah, there was some recent research that came out that documented that Canada geese, or different geese, were able to identify the faces of the other geese that they lived with, the family members, so forth. And they could recognize individual features like the bill features, the facial markings, and probably the voice of those other geese. And that it's just like we can look at a goose and it's just a goose. But the geese are distinguishing all of those fine features that can tell their family from the other families of geese and so forth. And as we learn more about this, it's very likely that the trumpeter swans they have to be able to identify their own family members because they stay together for a whole year, even when they're on a wintering location with hundreds and hundreds of other swans. So I think this is a research project that I'll share with our board, and we can share it beyond that too, so that people can read this and just enjoy the fact that the more we learn about this, research is giving us answers to some of the behavior that we see in the wild, where these swans, for example, have incredible life histories and abilities, even for identification. You wonder if that swan recognized me from those years that I was helping with rearing out at Carlos Avery, or recognized my voice. I'm not sure, but it's kind of fun to hypothesize what was going on there.
Great. Okay. And I have another question before Marianne gets to the questions that have been submitted. So for the adolescent swan, so once the parents kick the kids out, after they come back, that second summer, what happens to them? Are they loners? Do they group together? What sort of their behavior that they do as adolescents, non-breeders?
They would essentially become floaters who would be exploring the area and then eventually forming groups that would be collectively foraging together in grain fields. If you travel through northwestern Minnesota up in the Detroit Lakes area in like mid-May, you would see some of these fallow fields that may have probably not even been planted yet, where the birds are out picking up waste grain. And one of our highlight features for birds every year is the Detroit Lakes Festival of Birds. And I would highly recommend that as a place where you can learn a lot about Minnesota wildlife and have a chance to do some wonderful field trips out there where you're going to see trumpeter swans in numbers you've never imagined.
Marianne, are there any questions there?
Yes, Margaret, we do have several questions. The first one is from Val, and Val asks, could you explain what went into the figures for what a swan is worth?
When I worked on those statistics, first of all, if you went to a private breeder who had trumpeter swans, the going rate would be about $400. But then what we did is I looked at the figures of what we had to spend in terms of caring for the swan cygnets and rearing them and feeding them for those 2 years. And then we basically divided that out by the number of cygnets being produced. So it was basically a pretty straightforward accounting process where actually we weren't looking at a lot of donated time. We were just looking at what the state was spending for the rearing, with work that was being done by Peggy Hines to pick out the release areas, and Steve Kettleson for caring for the swans and building the wintering facilities out at Carlos Avery. So again, those are numbers that are essentially 30 plus years out of date. But but again, that's the best we could come up with. It wasn't just an estimate. It was based on what we spent there.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question from Paul. What do swans that overwinter in Minnesota and Wisconsin eat? Do they fast?
They're actually very creative here in Minnesota. When we had lots of birds wintering by Monticello, they were flying out to Big Lake and feeding on scraps of potatoes in the potato fields after the potatoes were harvested. So that would be a pretty high energy, nutritious source of food. And in more recent years, we get a lot of reports from birds that are field feeding in like picked cornfields or combine cornfields and feeding on the waste grain, corn or soybeans. And you can see that again in the following spring, where you see them out in the grain fields that have been harvested. So they've pioneered into places where there's still food available, and then they are still staying basically much of their time where there's open water, but then they're flying out to forage during the day on grain.
Great, thank you. We do have time for a couple more questions. If anybody wants to continue to answer them, there are a couple still in that I'll go ahead here and ask. One is from Tiffany. Why did Minnesota use both wing and neck bands?
We initially were using neck bands, but we had an unusual problem with neck bands because especially in far northern Minnesota, there were some people who were actually feeding the swans, I guess up toward Park Rapids and places north of there, where they were holding the birds there with feeding. And then that part of the state could have some incredibly cold spells where each time the bird dipped its neck down in the water and then back up again, the water was instantly freezing. And they were building up accumulations of ice that were detrimental to the birds. In some cases, they could hardly feed anymore because they couldn't lift the weight of the ice on their neck band. And we didn't see that as much of a problem farther south, but and it was especially, I think, accompanying the supplemental feeding that people were doing just as for their own fun. And so we stopped using neck bands as a marker. Now they're still used where we've got studies going on for telemetry where the birds are going south and the people don't need to worry about those horribly cold situations that we were having up in northern Minnesota, where you had maybe minus 25 or 30 degrees and the icing on the collars. The neck collars are still a very viable strategy for the research on the migration telemetry, but they're not in use in the areas where we were having the problem with icing on the neck collars. So we don't use those in the DNR anymore. And actually, we're not marking any birds anymore. They're all just allowed to survive on their own.
Thanks, Carol. We do have a question still coming in, so please continue. Okay. Robert says that he lives in Plymouth, Minnesota, and sees several pairs of swans, one in his neighborhood and one on a nearby lake. How common are swans in the metro area?
The swans are actually surprisingly common. They use a lot of the wetlands and lakes both surrounding the area, because we have some wonderful areas out in the Three Rivers Parks district, and up in the north part of the metro we have the Carlos Avery Wildlife Refuge. Just north of the Twin Cities we have Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, and then of course Minnesota Valley Wildlife Refuge. So we are a very fortunate metro area to have such a great abundance of wetland areas where the swans can check out these places and find places that they are successful. And so I would just say, just enjoy the birds. And you know, I live in Blaine, and there just the last week I had one fly right over my house. So it's something where it's a lot of delight just in our own lives, daily lives, being able to see these. We don't have to travel hundreds of miles to see this bird. It's probably a lot closer than you thought.
We still have questions coming in from an anonymous attendee who lives in Northwest British Columbia, where they've had a banded swan come every March for the past 3 years. They believe he's 20 years old, and they're wondering, what is the oldest swan you've seen?
Oldest one has been right at 25 years. So that's probably about the upper limit. Like with that swan number 9, the super mom, she was producing young until she was 24.
Wow.
And that to me is just amazing. And then when Sheila was sick for 3 years with cancer, Jim wasn't recording how many young she had each year during those 3 years. So on top of the 57 we know about, there were 3 mystery years where she could have produced over 60 cygnets during her lifetime. And those were birds that didn't just hatch. Those were the ones that survived all summer and migrated with her. So anyway, they continue to amaze us, and 20 years is good. And hopefully that bird will keep on coming for you.
Excellent.
Yeah, Marianne, this is Margaret. I just want to add a couple things. So Wisconsin had a bird, I forget the collar number, and the only way you can actually track the age of the bird and tell is if it has a collar or some kind of marking. But and this was a bird that was up in Burnett County in northwest Wisconsin, and I think it was over 30 years the last time it was sighted. And then out in Washington State, there near Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge, there was a very famous bird out there, a male bird, and it had the nickname of Solo, and it lived well over 30 years. Actually, was quite aged before it actually found a mate. So, right, so they can live long if they don't hit power lines or don't get shot or don't have diseases or whatever. So that was it.
We have a couple questions that are asking about the future of trumpeter swans, and I'm thinking, Carol, maybe if you could answer, and then maybe if any of our other panelists would also care to answer. The first is from Dave. What do you foresee on the future of trumpeter swans in Minnesota? What do you expect for monitoring and population growth?
Well, it's a pretty optimistic point of view, I guess. One of the things that's amazing about trumpeters is that we have not had significant issues with disease or lead poisoning or other problems that have caused issues with other types of waterfowl or water birds. We've been very fortunate so far on that issue. I expect us to see a continuing filling of potential habitat here in Minnesota, and I think that we're going to reach kind of a tipping point somewhere where we're pretty well maxed out in terms of available wetlands, because these birds space themselves out and create their territories. And I think that's why we're seeing such a encouraging dispersal of birds into the Dakotas, into Manitoba, Ontario. So Minnesota is actually fulfilling a very important role right now to help restore populations where those birds may have been missing for the last 100 years or more. And so I think that by having a healthy growing population here in Minnesota, that helps spread the good news. And I made a trip up into southeast Manitoba back in 2008, and was visiting with officials from their Department of Natural Resources. And we saw the first pair of trumpeter swans that they had seen in southeastern Manitoba for many years. And that was just the beginning. And now they've got even more birds regularly showing up that apparently were dispersing. And at that time, they wanted me to look at some of their lakes up there and tell me, would they be good for restoring trumpeter swans? And I said, you don't need to pay anything to restore trumpeter swans. Just wait a few years and they will find it, and they'll find your wetlands. And sure enough, they did. So the best thing about this is that we put in an initial investment, but the birds are really repaying that investment many times over in terms of the biological benefits of spreading that population into our adjacent provinces and western states.
This is Margaret. Jim Hawkins, I kind of like to hear from you, since you're from the Yukon, which is sort of like a whole different set of information about trumpeter swans. What are you guys seeing up there in terms of population numbers or productivity, in terms of, I don't know if things are happening with climate change or not climate change or whatever. What's going on up in your area?
I don't actually work for the government agencies anymore. I retired, but my sense is that we don't have a great idea because we don't do a 5-year survey anymore, and a lot of the territory is very remote. You really can't get much information without using airplanes and so on. So I think the population is still slowly growing here, but we really don't have any good numbers on that. But there's lots of them around, and every spring they come through the migration areas here in big numbers. So they're doing well here, but we don't know exactly how well.
Dennis asks, again, it's a similar question, but what are the plans and how do we see the population growing across North America?
I think at this point, we can really encourage the individual states to use their ornithologist union, their private reporting system like we have for trumpeters and the Trumpeter Swan Society. It's really important for people to report swans when they first show up nesting. We've had lots of excited ranchers, I guess, out in the Dakotas who were surprised and pleased to have trumpeters show up on some of their potholes. And I think that we're going to see those types of responses to appropriate habitat. We have really, really good wetlands restoration programs with federal and state agencies, everything from state departments of natural resources to Ducks Unlimited and other organizations that are all helping preserve wetlands. And with a healthy system of wetlands restored and managed, that just lays the opportunity for the trumpeters to discover those at some point and take over nesting. So I think we're going to just see a nice expansion of both range and population size. And then when states have their state breeding bird atlas projects, that helps fill in the blanks as well.
This is Margaret. I'd just like to add up to that. And thanks, Carol, for doing that. We at the Trumpeter Swan Society see swan populations as sort of different across the continent. So, in the Midwest, they're doing quite well, although within the states, different states have different population numbers. So Iowa certainly isn't even close to Minnesota, and Ohio isn't close to Minnesota or Wisconsin in terms of population number. Out west, there's more of a problem with wetlands that might be drying up, or wetland availability and temperature and altitude and that kind of thing, which is affecting nesting. So those population numbers are not expanding, certainly at the rate that the Midwest swans are. And so there's variability there. And also out in Oregon, we have an Oregon restoration project, and we're actively working to restore trumpeter swans to Oregon. So, we have population goals that we're working with the Pacific Flyway, on that. So population for trumpeter swans varies across North America. So there are different plans and different goals and expectations depending on which flyway you're in, which state you're in, or which province you're in. So it's sort of a mixed bag, but they're doing quite well in the Midwest, certainly in Minnesota.
Thank you, Margaret. Linnell asked a question that sounds simple, but I suspect is not necessarily a simple answer, and that is, how much space does a pair of swans need?
Some of the marshes that they use can be surprisingly small. You hear of maybe 20, 25 acres. I think if they come to a wetland that might be up to 100 acres, they would probably defend that against other swans. So, I've seen Canada geese nesting within 3 feet of each other, really packing in. But with trumpeter swans, they're very defensive, not only against potential predators, but also in maintaining a territory that's large enough to sustain their whole family. Because if they've got 5 cygnets that are each eating 20 pounds of wet forage a day, they need a lot of aquatic vegetation to support that family. So if it's a very irregular type of a wetland that has nooks and crannies for birds to nest, they might be able to support an extra pair or two on 100 or 200 acres. But otherwise, if it's like a big open round wetland, that pair is probably going to defend it against anything else. And that's why a wetland complex with many medium to smaller wetlands will support a lot more swans than just a few much larger wetlands.
Are there any more swans being collared?
Not within Minnesota by the DNR anyway. That they are being marked for the birds with the migration study with Dr. David Anderson and his crew. And those have neck collars with radios attached. And those are yielding some absolutely wonderful and amazing information on their migration, because one of the things that's a really interesting feature of this whole species is that when all of the trumpeter swans were killed off in the central United States, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ontario, Manitoba, their entire migratory tradition was destroyed. We don't know where those birds would have wintered originally because they would disappear before anybody was keeping records. And once the birds were being reintroduced, they had to pioneer and explore and find places where they could survive over winter, not die, not get killed, and come back with their family the next spring. We had some incidents early on where a whole family would show up in a southern state and somebody would shoot the whole family because they didn't really know what it was, but they killed it anyway. And so there was a lot of unnecessary mortality those early years. And now states are much more aware and concerned and protective of those wintering swan populations because they're attracting people. And it's a lot of interest to find out what are these birds and what's their story. And as the birds discover what are these new refuges, the new wetlands, new reservoirs, they're finding places that probably didn't even exist historically as a wintering destination. There are probably a lot of wintering destinations that got drained or destroyed in the meantime. So the birds are having to rediscover a new evolutionary migratory tradition. And that's what Dr. Anderson and his research team are finding out right now. So this is going to be another chapter in the whole book of swans about their new wintering traditions. And I don't think they're going to go all the way to the Gulf. They don't need that warmer climate. They have such a big coat of down that they'll be just fine in those central states like I described in my talk.
This is Margaret, and thanks for that, Carol, because that GPS study, and there's one for the Western swans as well as the Midwest swans. Those are really yielding some really wonderful information. You know, one of the questions was, are any swans being marked? Yes, in Ontario, they're marked every winter, usually like I think in early February, late January, with wing tags. Out west in Oregon, we're putting green collars on them. In Montana, the Flathead program, which I think finished this program, they have red collars, and then the Blackfoot Challenge in Montana has red collars, and then the Pacific Flyway, you know, that's where they've mandated like green collars. So yes, swans are still being marked. Wisconsin stopped it in 2012, and I think Iowa just stopped it when they completed their release program in the last couple of years, because every time they had a swan release, they would put collars on that. And then in the Yellowstone area, they also put leg bands on the swans because the national park out there didn't want to have it where there were neck collars on the swan. So if you go to Yellowstone, there'd be like bright yellow leg bands with a coat on them. And I think around the Madison River area, they're red. So yes, there are. And if you ever see any marked swans, we call those marked. If they have a neck collar, wing tag, or leg band, we do have a Trumpeter Watch program. And if you submit a Trumpeter Watch report, then I send your report and any photos that you took to the agency or person who did the banding, so they have all that information.
Thanks, Margaret. We have had a couple people commenting about their observations of trumpeter swans. So if we could maybe send out the information about the Trumpeter Watch program, that would be great so that people can send in their observations. The last question is from Bente, and he's asking about really about wetlands and the relationship between trumpeter swans and wetlands, and if and particularly the filling in of wetlands as our communities grow.
Well, that's a story that has a lot of aspects to it. We have some government projects, federal projects, state projects for preserving wetlands. We have in Minnesota an additional excise tax, or sales tax, excuse me, for habitat for wildlife. That is the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund. And that puts millions of dollars from expenditures by Minnesotans each year into land acquisition. And these are projects that are used for funding land protection and wetland restoration on a big scale by Ducks Unlimited, by Pheasants Forever, by the Department of Natural Resources. All of these different agencies are benefiting. Also, that they call the CREP program, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. These are local projects that are making a big difference in terms of not just trying to do a little bit at a time, but thinking big, because that program generates a huge amount of income. We also have land protection and acquisition from our state lottery. The lottery tickets, some of that goes into conservation through the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources. It's called LCCMR. That money can also be used for education projects. It's being used for helping with the swan migration project right now, and it's also being used for habitat protection. So with those two big sources of funding coming from Minnesota lottery players and people who pay the sales tax on anything they buy, that has made a big difference. But that there's still this attrition of wetlands that are being encroached on for development in urban areas, and also a continuing loss of farmland habitat, which is another really unfortunate loss, because there are a lot of wetlands that would have previously existed on existing farmlands that are now growing corn and soybeans. And those are areas where people really need to step up and participate in their CRP, Conservation Reserve programs. And I just signed up for creating a 6-acre marsh on my family farm down in Iowa. I have a meeting coming up for that in about 2 weeks. It's not a very big marsh, but in central Iowa, it would be considered a big marsh.
Thank you, Carol. And I want to thank all of the attendees for joining, for staying with us this long, for asking such wonderful questions. Carol, we've had a lot of comments about the remarkable success story of the swans, and also on your presentation itself. So thank you very much for sharing your story with us. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Margaret Smith, the executive director of the Trumpeter Swan Society, to close.
Okay, great. All right. Well, as Marianne said, thanks so much, you guys, for coming, and to Carol for that great presentation, and our panelists. I really appreciate you being part of this and helping us share the wonderful world of trumpeter swans, and hopefully you'll continue to learn. Right after this, you'll receive a very short survey. It's just 4 questions. I hope you'll answer that. And then this is being recorded, and I'm going to upload it to YouTube, and I should have that available to you, that I'll send out in a link in about 3 days. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar, which will be in December on the trumpeter swans in Heber Springs, Arkansas. So thank you.